National Press Club today, a debate on climate change. Lord Christopher Monckton is a noted sceptic who travels the world challenging the notion humans are solely responsible. He faces Dr. Richard Dennis, economist, executive director of the Australia Institute and former advisor to the Greens, today at the National Press Club.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the Press Club and today's National Australia Bank address. In fact, it is a debate on climate change, one of the issues that is causing so much controversy with the Australian people as the political debate plays out. But today we are very pleased to bring a debate between Richard Dennis, Dr Dennis, a former advisor to Democrats leader, one-time Democrats leader Natasha Stott-Despoja. Dr Dennis is Executive Director of the Australia Institute and an adjunct professor with the Australian National University. He will be debating Lord Christopher Monckton, a gentleman on his third visit to Australia, it's fair to say, on a tour that has courted some controversy. In fact, probably not since Joe Cocker was deported in '73, have we seen? A British tour caused such controversy. Christopher Monckton is a well-known climate sceptic, and he will be taking up the cudgels for that aspect of the debate. We have had a toss, and Richard Dennis will open the bowling. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr Dennis.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks to the Press Club and to Lord Monckton and, of course, to the audience for paying attention to what is a very, very important issue. Some would say the most important issue of our time. Now, I have to begin with a confession. It's true I worked for the Democrats and worked for the Greens, but I have not and am not and will not ever be a member of the scientific community. I am an economist, and I'm here today to talk about the way that economists and certainly politicians, as a general rule, go about making decisions under uncertainty. This is not an unusual situation for individuals to find themselves in, certainly not an unusual situation for politicians to find themselves in. Making questions when some people have doubts is, in fact, core business for citizens and for policymakers. So let me start with an analogy. Imagine that you went to the doctor, and I hope this doesn't happen, but imagine that you were diagnosed with a skin cancer, and the doctor, having diagnosed this skin cancer, suggested an intense and rapid treatment. The treatment unpleasant and potentially expensive, but the prognosis was good. Now that's bad news, and you might wish that it were other, so you might get a second opinion. You go to see another doctor, they confirm the diagnosis. You see a third doctor, you see a fourth doctor, they all confirm the diagnosis. But after after shopping around for long enough, spending more time while the cancer potentially spreads, you finally find a doctor who advises you that you don't have cancer. And even if you did have cancer, chemotherapy and radiotherapy are unlikely to work. There's plenty of evidence on the internet to suggest that herbal remedies would be far more effective. What would you do? What would you do? If there are people out there telling you don't act. There are people out there saying the solutions won't work. But how would you, as a person, make a decision under such uncertainty? Now, I reckon most people would go with the science, and I think it's, called me old-fashioned, but I think it's just common sense. And I certainly suspect that our children and our family would encourage us to take the cautious route and listen to the science, not the optimistic route that perhaps the science is wrong and anyway maybe the treatments don't work. Now, anyone can ask a tricky question, but not all of us can make hard decisions. And we do have to make hard decisions when we make decisions about health, when we make decisions about climate change. Making hard decisions is something that adults have to do. But tricky questions can often get in the way of hard decisions. Imagine one of your friends discourages you from seeking treatment, says you can't trust these doctors, what do they know? They say the sun causes skin cancer. You go back and you ask them, you say, if I get sunburnt tomorrow, when will I get a skin cancer and on what part of my body will it appear? And if they can't answer, then why would you trust them? Why would you pursue a potentially unpleasant and even costly course of action? Again, common sense suggests that most of us, while we might have those questions in our mind, will probably be willing and able to make a hard decision. Now, the overwhelming scientific consensus of climate change, of climate scientists on climate change, is that climate change is occurring, that the planet is warming, that it's human-induced, and that if we are to reduce our levels of pollution, that we have a good chance of turning things around. And when I say scientists, I mean NASA, I mean CSIRO, I mean the Australian and American Academies of Science. These bodies are quite clear in their statements. They are quite clear in their diagnosis, and they are quite clear in the prescription that they suggest that we take. But let's be clear, today you're watching a debate between two non-climate scientists. I'm not a climate scientist, Lord Monckton isn't a climate scientist, but we both obviously have an interest in the decisions that we as a society will make. The question is, how will we use the data that's provided to us by those esteemed bodies, or will we ignore that? That's a question for us as individuals, it's a question for us as a society, but we need to be clear about whose expertise that we are going to take. When we talk about experts, I'm not a climate scientist, most of you aren't climate scientists, we all have to make these decisions. It's not just the climate scientists that have made these decisions. In fact, in Australia, that well-known warmist John Howard accepted the science of climate change. He accepted that we needed to tackle climate change, and yes, he was reluctant to ratify the Kyoto Protocol, but in 2007, of course, he proposed the introduction of a price on pollution to tackle climate change. It's not just John Howard, of course. We've seen, in fact, nearly every leader of the Liberal Party has accepted the science of climate change, back to Andrew Peacock, Brendan Nelson, Malcolm Turnbull, and Tony Abbott, at least half of the time, seems to support the science of climate change. His support for climate science is about as reliable as his support for Peter Reith, but it is there at least some of the time. And it's not just Conservative politicians who are the warmists. We find in Australia that the big mining companies, the big oil companies, all accept the science of climate change. Their submissions to the Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme inquiries overwhelmingly supported the science of climate change. And in Australia we have Ralph Hillman, the head of the Coal Association, along with a number of other leaders of the minerals community, all supporting both the science of climate change, and Marius Kloppers, the head of BHP, the biggest mining company in the world, not only supports the science of climate, but Marius Kloppers actually supports the introduction of a carbon tax to tackle the problem. Warmist. My point is that not only is the vast majority of climate scientists looked at the evidence and drawn these conclusions, our business leaders, our politicians from all sides of the political fence have actually taken that same advice and around the world are acting on it today. Not acting nearly fast enough, but acting nonetheless. Of course, it could be part of a giant conspiracy with BHP, Greenpeace, John Howard and my good self meeting regularly to discuss our proposals. Or it could just be that good people of goodwill, people who respect the evidence from a vast variety of backgrounds, have all accepted the same overwhelming conclusion and have all accepted that we should act. Now, even though the scientific community leaves very little room for doubt and very little room for uncertainty, even if there was uncertainty, most humans, most of the time, actually adopt the insurance principle when considering how to make decisions. That is, most of us insure our cars. Most of us spend $1,000 or more a year insuring our cars, and very few of us get to the end of the year and think, idiot, didn't crash my car. What am I doing? Wasting my money on a precaution that didn't even turn out to be necessary. As individuals, as a society, this is not how we make decisions about uncertainty. It's not responsible, indeed it's not even mature. And we usually find the people with the people without insurance are usually people we describe as perhaps being adolescent or even immature. The sensible thing to do when the overwhelming body of evidence suggests that we should act and the costs of that action are small is to act. Now let me turn to the cost of action, because it's interesting that so many of the climate sceptics are also policy sceptics. That is, there's no reason to assume this would have to be the case, but so many people who don't trust the science don't trust the economics. And of course I'm referring here again to Tony Abbott, because Tony Abbott can't find a single economist in the country who will suggest that his scheme is in fact cheaper. So for the sceptics who tell us they're terrified of wasting billions of dollars tackling climate change, I would ask the simple question, why aren't you far more concerned with the cost of Tony Abbott's direct action scheme when every economist in the country, Tony Abbott can't find a single economist in the country to stand up and say his scheme is cheaper? Why is it that the climate sceptics are also economic sceptics? Are they all in on the conspiracy? Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.